Hello and welcome to this special edition of Channel 51 News. And I have to say, I am doing this interview today for all of us, but specifically it is a celebration of 5 years plus of hard work for yours truly, myself. The man I'm going to introduce you today, well, I tell you what, he is one of the shining lights in the medical fraternity. And like many of us, he woke up during this period of time and he has turned into, well, you will probably already know him because he has a massive following on social media, YouTube, well over 600,000 followers, and that's just the start. But the thing is, it wasn't always this way, and that is the amazing thing about what everyone is doing right now. We are learning in real time that the system is broken, that the people running the system, power corrupts absolutely. And that is just the start. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but let me introduce you to him right now for a very open discussion for the next hour. Dr. Suneel Dhand is a board-certified internal medicine physician specializing in metabolic health and lifestyle medicine. He was born in London, graduated from Cardiff University's medical school before completing his residency in Baltimore. Currently practicing in northeastern USA, he has over 20 years' experience. He's passionate about preventative medicine. He's a health entrepreneur, avid writer, public speaker, certified personal trainer, advocating for real food, exercise, and stress reduction to optimize health. He's also the owner of this immensely popular YouTube channel that speaks to all of us who have trusted our intuition long enough to know that we have been shortchanged by the system that is clearly broken. It is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome him onto this very special edition of Channel 51 for an open and honest discussion about global health with one of the world's shining lights on the subject, Dr. Suneel Dhand. Welcome to Channel 51.
Jason, it is an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you as well for all of your work and that introduction. And I really hope and know that the viewers are going to gain a lot from our discussion now.
Well, thank you so much. And it is one of those things that you do have to, we say blow smoke up in that direction, but it's a lot more than that. It is a recognition of the amount of work that any doctor in our lifetimes we know are the hardest working people. You talk to a doctor in a surgery, they've got patients lined up. They work a few days in this practice, they work at a different situation over here. If you're a surgeon, you're in and out, etc. You're running other businesses, you're public speaking, you're taking time out of your day. Do doctors have a 36-hour day or something? How do you manage to fit everything in?
Well, I think in Australia, in your country, the hours might be slightly less than in the USA, certainly, and maybe the UK as well. But yes, and I'm glad you started with that, because I think a lot of us grew up with the notion that being a doctor is a very noble profession. I still think there's a lot of good things, obviously, about being a doctor. But many of us over the last few years, including many of us in the medical profession, have woken up to the fact that the heart of medicine is broken. And I don't believe that it's enough now for doctors, whether we're talking about in the United States, UK, Australia, to simply hide under the guise of, we work very hard, we go to school for a long time, therefore we deserve this respect. In all honesty, I don't believe the medical profession deserves respect. I believe that the medical profession has sadly completely sold out. I don't blame individual doctors. Of course, we all know some very good doctors out there. But the reality is that something very bad has happened. This is reflected in everything we're seeing around us. And I actually believe that many of the societal issues that we see today in our countries, which have similar cultures, and we'll talk more about my thoughts on how the metabolic health disaster, obesity crisis, diabetes crisis is very much a cultural issue more than it is a food environment issue. We'll get to that. But I think that had doctors been on the ball and the medical profession been doing its job properly, we wouldn't have seen many of these disasters. And the key turning point for many of us thought that things were wrong for a long time, but the pandemic opened up the eyes of many logical doctors. And also, I'm very thankful, many members of the general public like yourself who have done tremendous work during these few years under the threat of censorship and other sanctions. So thank you to you, everyone else watching and listening, for being here and understanding that something is wrong. Now, the question is, how do we filter out all of the bad from the medical profession, and how do we return medicine back to its true roots?
One of the most difficult things was the loss of the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship and therefore the right to a second opinion. Now, this was something that we all thought was a natural process, but during COVID, that was taken away. And it was also taken away further when the government or the bureaucrats then put a new layer on top of your local doctor to intimidate. And I used to make the comparison. Imagine a young female Chinese 5'1", 5'2", 25-year-old, 26-year-old doctor, and having to answer to a 60-year-old silver-haired giant of a man, and there would be a sort of an internal hierarchy. Then add the idea that your license can be taken away. How do we expect some of these younger doctors to not fall into this trap because they've just spent an absolute fortune in terms of becoming a doctor in both money and time? You're almost taken hostage by the system. So I wonder, therefore, where that brave person comes out. But you managed to do it and navigate it in a way. You're not a young man, you're not an old man, and you've seen enough to do it. What made it possible for you to do it and for so many others not to?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to personal principles. I'm of the belief I'm a great reader of history as well. And as everyone knows, history, if not repeats itself, it rhymes. And we've seen this pattern with the medical profession before. Yes, you got to a really good point that nowadays doctors are entirely captured. So you take a new doctor, and it's much worse in the United States. We're talking about sometimes $1 million in debt, and they're totally beholden to the system. And they're going to want to put their heads down, work, pay off the debt. They've studied for years and years. But still, we have to ask ourselves, is that an excuse? Because I'm also of the belief that somebody who wants to find an excuse will always find an excuse. And I've seen this myself. So I think I've always been somebody who prides myself on having principles. I've been brought up that way. I'm somebody who's not afraid of taking risks. I also had my career on the line. In fact, at one stage, under the threat of those horrible, illegal, coercive mandates, I was getting ready to leave the United States. I thought under the previous administration, I would not be allowed to work as a doctor. But I also had belief in myself. If it came to that, I would find something else to do and try to make a success of that. I don't believe in being fearful when principles are at stake. But sadly, the truth is that a lot of people are not like that. And I've seen all sorts of excuses around me because I've had these discussions with doctors. Why didn't you stand up against mandates? Why didn't you say it was really cruel to make people die alone? Why did you support lockdowns? Why did you go along with it? And let me tell you something, Jason, there's always an excuse. Oh, you know what? I've just graduated. I don't want to rock the boat. Oh, I'm midway through my career. I've got kids. Oh, I'm about to retire. Why should I do it? People who are going to find excuses for not being brave will always find those excuses. So I don't think we can put it down to just, doctors are captured. I think there's a bigger issue going on here, and society has become very, it's become very adamant on having systems in place, getting people in cookie cutter jobs, thinking one-dimensionally because that's the way you've been taught all the way through school, not thinking outside the box. And I would take it a step further that many of the problems we see in society, which even go beyond health and well-being, at the root of them is a complete deficit of bravery and courage. And that is something that has dramatically changed over the last few decades.
As you were speaking then, I had a flashback to year 8 commerce, and specialisation and interdependence was what we learnt. And I remember coming home and thinking, wow, I'm no longer a little kid anymore. I'm learning about how the world works. And you've just described it there in terms of the medical profession. So much information, so much commitment, and yet at the same time, so pigeonholed, cookie-cutted to a point where there's not much left for you but to just become a cog in the system and therefore realize, okay, this is all I am. But on the contrary, what you really are as a doctor is a pillar of the community, but you must earn that pillar. You can't claim respect. You have to earn it. And I think that's the great distinction there. And therefore, you've created a divide with the two parts of the medical fraternity. Those willing to stand up on the shoulders of the community and say, this is what we're going to do. And others that are going to say, no, we're just going to follow along regardless. Now, There's a lot I want to get onto, and maybe a couple more questions on COVID before we move on, because one of the big topics of today's discussion will be on entitlement as it has infected our community today. And it's become almost political now that we have such a great divide. And the US, thankfully, is leading this under the Trump administration by literally trying to create self-sufficiency, but by giving you all the tools in order to do that, by making things positive again. But we've coming out of a system, and certainly in the rest of the West, we've seen it in the UK and in Australia and in Canada. It's become so difficult that we have a young community today that I describe as having become financial nihilists. They've given up. And then when you get Klaus Schwab telling you that you'll own nothing and be happy, and they've already given up, well, it's pretty clear that that my generation, the Gen Xers, may well be the last ones that did the old school, the 30 years of working in the mailroom before getting moved up to parcels, never getting promoted, never getting a pay rise, but being able to get into the system. But our children, as hard as we're working to get them a start, are realizing that it's kind of impossible. Parking that for a moment, going back to COVID, was there any stage in the narrative there that you scratched your head and you said, I don't know if this is a natural thing, possibly could be man-made? Did you ever get that feeling?
Are you talking about the origin of the COVID virus?
Yes.
That's a really interesting question. So I would say that right at the beginning, and I remember posting about this at the time, I believed that it was a natural virus. And then actually I started hearing more and more. I thought it was from mistreatment of animals. And then you had like close contact. We all knew which animals possibly were involved, like rodent-like animals in China. And I thought that was feasible. And then I started hearing more and more. But the one eye-opener, this is really interesting. So I actually, I was in the process. This was at 2021, where I was actually reaching out to different hospitals, which were really busy with COVID. One of them was in New York City, and I went over there to go and work for a few weekends. And when I was there, I met a relative who came in of a patient who had COVID, and she was actually a doctor. She was actually a specialized hematopathologist with her own lab somewhere in Maryland. And she sat down with me and she said, you do understand that this is not a natural virus. And she talked me through the whole thing about how she had looked very carefully at the way the virus was sequenced. It didn't look natural. It looked entirely man-made. And it was then when she said this to me, as somebody who was very well qualified, but clearly somebody who wouldn't be allowed to speak on social media, I thought, yeah, you may be right. And then I started hearing more and more. So I was about a year into it where I realized that there's a very big chance that this was not natural. It came from a lab. And that makes it even more horrendous. And also, coming back to the medical profession, the overwhelming evidence now is that's the case. It was man-made. You hardly hear one peep from the medical establishment in any country about this is absolutely outrageous. The biggest event of many of our lifetimes was actually man-made. And there's no curiosity. There's no demand to get to the bottom of it. And it makes me just sort of feel like almost tearing my hair out. Like, you're doctors. How do you not have this question? But there seems to be no interest whatsoever from the ranks of doctors.
That is the point, isn't it? So they literally are happy to be taken hostage at that point. And then you have the mental condition of Stockholm syndrome. I'm just going to put up a quick graphic for you. Sure. This is off the White House only a few weeks, maybe a few months ago. Lab leak, the true origins of COVID-19. So let me just have a look here. Was prompted by Dr. Fauci to push the preferred narrative that COVID originated naturally. So there is now a willingness in the United States government, the FBI and the CIA both now agreeing, but they use the term lab leak, almost as if to say an admission man-made, but we accidentally let it out, because that's been the next prevailing narrative, almost like the slow walk back. It is feasibly and logically impossible to think that you would make something and it would leak out at an inconvenient moment. Why would you make it in the first place if there was no intention to use it on something else? You don't just make it for the scientific discoveries that you might get from there. So this is also quite nasty, and it's one of those moments in history that you go, come on now, let's just get to the bottom of this. Do you feel did you believe the lab leak story, or did you know that was another gatekeeping exercise, or did you believe it like I did?
So I now believe it, but are you talking about it being deliberate versus accidental?
Correct.
Okay. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all, but given that we didn't all believe the lab leak, whether it was deliberate, we'd have to ask who did it. I think the bigger question is Fauci being involved in this research from the beginning. I think he knew in his mind right from the beginning that there was a very big chance that this was man-made from research that he had been involved in funding. And for that man to go out on TV every single day as the hero and then push the shots when they came out, be involved financially in other ways. And again, everywhere he goes, pretty much every university, I'm sure this would happen in Australia, this man is hailed as a hero. And makes you wonder again, medical profession, what on earth, how can you not have this question? It's so bizarre and so very disappointing.
There was the famous email from a fellow called Christian Anderson who wrote to Fauci and referred to some 8 non-random mutations there. And then a little while later, he gets a great big grant and he reverses his process. So you now know that there has to be a cover-up and certainly intention at this point. Have you ever been able to, perhaps in a lunchroom, a meeting of colleagues or something like that, bring out this particular discussion? And can you extend it at all? And do you get any change of mind amongst colleagues?
I have many times brought this up, and I do have a few colleagues who agree with me, but I would say the vast majority of doctors are simply not interested. It is so weird, and I can't explain it. It shows that the heart of medicine is broken. They don't have these basic questions. I mean, I've used the example many times when the shots first came out. I immediately, when I saw the headline, I went to the journal article online. I read it. It takes about 10 minutes, and right away I had questions like, how long has it been tested for? This is not going to eradicate anything. The number needed to treat is huge. And I wrote a blog piece at the time, and this is before my other social media started taking off, and I was attacked completely by other doctors who were saying, no, this is going to be the end. And they were taking selfies of them getting the injections with hashtag the end. And right then I decided to ask around me, people immediately around me and also online, doctor, have you read the study? Did you take 10 minutes to do that? And overwhelmingly, the answer was, no, we haven't done it. And I was thinking, so you're just going on a mainstream media headline? And every few months, I kept repeating this exercise as it all played out. And overwhelmingly, doctors were saying, I haven't read the study. And again, I use the phrase, tear my hair out. Like, you're a doctor. This is the biggest medical story of your lifetime. And you couldn't even spend 10 minutes to critically appraise a study. You're just going along with the flow. Insanity. It is no explanation for this widespread ignorance from a profession that should be respected.
This is exactly my experience. We were going through the period of telehealth at the time. That was the only way you could get an appointment. And I had a doctor that I believed I could trust that was local. And during the early days, I asked her about the vaccine, and she said to me, "Oh, look, I won't be going down that pathway. I've got too many questions. It's not proven, et cetera, et cetera." And I thought, well, this is really good. Yeah. Then I rang her up maybe a month or two later. It wasn't very much later. And there was another issue that I was concerned about. And she pushed the vaccine on me. Over the phone, of course. Wow. And I questioned her and I said, why did you change your mind? How could it possibly be proven safe in the period between the last conversation and this one? And she gave me a response, which was pretty much that she was going along to get along. And then she gave me another reason to not trust her. And I said, look, I can't do this anymore. I will not be completing this consultation and you won't be getting paid. And I hung up the phone expecting someone.
I'm so proud of you. That's amazing.
Well, thank you. Because I was expecting someone from the surgery to call me back to ask for payment. And maybe it was just done on our Medicare and maybe they did charge me, but I never heard from them again. But here's the punchline. Less than 12 months later, that entire practice closed down. Gone. Really? Yeah, and that is highly unusual because it had 4 or 5 doctors. It was a local suburban practice, and it was quite busy. There was nothing other wrong with them, but they've gone, vanished, and it's been replaced by a national disability insurance scheme business that's running in there, which is another big profit-making thing here in Australia in those premises. That was astonishing. I don't know what happened to the doctors. I never bothered to follow up, but I thought that is just maybe a little bit of poetic justice, but so disappointing because you trust your doctor and it takes a long time to find a GP in your local area that you do trust. It's a bit like finding a restaurant that you like.
Yep, I agree. And it's so bizarre. Let me ask you a question, Jason. You're clearly as well a very critical thinking and intelligent man, and you've clearly thought things through as I have. We're obviously pointing the fingers here a lot at the medical profession, as we should, but do you think that actually what we've witnessed is simply humans being humans? And when we look at it in the context of history, humans are mob-like animals and they just follow a direction, and only very few are ever capable of taking a step back and asking questions. Do you think that this is just a mere reflection of humans as a whole being insane, especially under a threat? Or do you think that there was something very specific to this?
I think that's the point for me that has driven me to the point or to the brink. I honestly thought that with the information that was coming out, that we would be able to change minds and do it massively in a short period of time. I remember distinctly watching Dr. Mike Yeadon giving that interview early on, about an hour, and at the end of it, he was visibly shaken. He was literally frightened, and he said, "We've got real big problems here, etc." And I slept on that. I watched it with my wife, and the next morning I woke up and I said, "We have two jobs to do here. The first one is a grassroots movement, and I'm going to call it," I said, "A Million Mums for Informed Consent." We're going to build a website and we're going to educate with everything that we know. And the other thing we're going to do through doing this news service, this daily statistical reporting, is to go after Anthony Fauci, because he knows exactly what's going on here, and we're already at the point of the non-random mutations. So that was my distinct reaction at the time. We set up A Million Mums. Within 2 days, we had 25,000 followers on Facebook, and it was going crazy. And then within 6 months, Facebook, of course, took it down, and we were never able to rebuild it at that point. The one thing we did do was build a website, and the biggest page on the website, you wouldn't believe this, was homeschooling. We got so much traffic for our information on homeschooling. We became homeschooling parents ourselves. And of course, where we live now in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales is the biggest homeschooling community in New South Wales, if not Australia now. It is so popular that they have even had athletics carnivals and swimming carnivals organised by the parents. So when people say you can't socialise your kids homeschooling, it's an absolute nonsense. It is the opposite. So that's a very sort of roundabout way to explain it. But I maintain that at the heart of this, my suspicions at the very beginning, that this was an exercise to compulsorily medicate the human population, which at that moment, once you do it, and I've already seen stories this week saying our DNA has been permanently changed. That is my point. If you can permanently change the DNA of the human species, what kind of person, organization, human being, higher power, non-human entity, I don't know, these are all the questions that are coming to me, is in control of this narrative to force this upon the people? Because fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I was never going to let that happen. And honestly, it started for me when I lost both my parents. I talk about this ad nauseum. I'm sorry to the audience for doing it. I lost both my parents in their early to mid 60s from lethal cancers: esophageal for dad, cardiac angiosarcoma for mum, Suneel, 300 cases in history. She was a career nurse. And the one thing that when I looked up the triggers for that, there were 4. High copper, low zinc, which is in everyone. Root canal therapy, which is, I believe, is in over 90% of terminal cancer patients have had root canal therapy. And the 4th one, a live flu vaccine. And mum was the infectious disease expert at air ambulance, clinical nurse specialist. She was always taking the jabs. And I pointed this out to her, and she said, "There's no such thing as a live flu vaccine." I said, "Well, mum, there has to be. And you've clearly had one, because this is the only trigger that we can find for cardiac angiosarcoma." Wow. And there it was. And so this just blew my mind, that that the taboo and anything that you're not allowed to speak about is clearly what you have to speak about. Yeah, this is the great thing. So
that is, and medicine, the history of medicine has taught us that over and over again, that it is those fringe theories that end up becoming true. And that was the other big eye opener with me, the willingness of doctors to suppress and censor information, which is total opposite of science. But yet they all were on board with it. I'll give you another example. About a year and a half into the pandemic, the Board of Internal Medicine in the United States sent out a rare email just warning everybody. I'm obviously an internal medicine doctor, saying we have your eyes on you. If you spread any misinformation with the vaccine, we're going to pull your certification for internal medicine. So this was a board that obviously I've been a part of for many years. I have never seen them once email about how can we make Americans healthier? How can we reduce healthcare costs? How do we give people a better experience? Not once did they ever email about that. And then they took the time during the pandemic to send out this mass warning email. And of course, 95% of doctors are going to be terrified after reading that. But what a bunch of scoundrels these people are. And it shows where their focus is on just enforcing a narrative. It's the total opposite of being a good doctor. I mean, I'm willing to listen to anyone, anytime, any theories, and especially when it comes to their bodies. Everybody knows their own bodies, but it's remarkable how doctors are willing to dismiss, like the concern you just mentioned with your mother, unfortunately, and not take these things seriously.
Mum was also an accident emergency nurse. She loved the urgency of it. She didn't like working on the ward, so she did that for many years as well. And often, as a young teen, when I got my driver's license, I'd be out on a Friday or a Saturday night, and sure enough, Mum was working the afternoon shift. So I'd call into North Shore Hospital in Sydney, where she would work, and I'd hang out with my mum for an hour at triage. And it was just nice to be amongst that, because she always fancied that I'd get into the medical business, whether I'd be a doctor or a nurse or an ambo. She didn't care. She just loved the fact that I was so interested. And she always used to always had an anecdote, always a story. There was always a nickname or something, whatever. But the one thing she said to me that stuck more than anything else was she said, always trust the mothers. Always listen to the mums. They will tell you and they will know. And yet go through COVID, and all of a sudden, nobody had any expertise except the hierarchy, Fauci, the government, the bureaucracy, and then maybe your GP, as long as the GP did what they were told. But for the rest of you, you didn't know anything. And your Prime Minister got on telly and said, you're locked down, the bottle shop drive-through is open, the fast food drive-through is open, you can't go to your local takeaway store, you can't hang out with your friends, we're going to put tape around the park benches, and you're not allowed out for more than an hour, we're not going to put you into the sun, and this is what you're going to go through. And so you literally had to stay home and you had to become active. I remember the first time ever I started becoming a pencil artist in between doing statistics videos. And so it opened up the possibility of other things. But how many people look back at that time and go, wow, if I'd had that 1 or 2 years over again, what might I do differently this time to understand what is going on? But it is such an horrific moment for all of us to go through so many times that you just can't understand. But to think that your knowledge is put behind somebody else's who is literally shouting a mantra. We had Greg Hunt in this country, the health minister, tied up with the WEF and Klaus Schwab. There was a picture of the book on his bookcase telling you this is an experiment and it's safe and effective. That is automatically an oxymoron, and that man needs to pay a price, but never once held to account, retires, and all we're waiting for now is for him to be announced as the next medical expert at the WEF on $2 million a year. Thank you. You just know it's coming.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I love what you said about the mothers being right and listening to mothers, or even soon to be mothers. One of the worst things I witnessed during the pandemic was I had nurses come up to me who were pregnant, or some who were thinking of becoming pregnant, but they were in tears. Look, we don't want to take this. It just doesn't feel right. And everyone knows, I mean, when will any human have more heightened senses than a pregnant lady? You are literally on alert all the time. You see everything, you smell everything, like everything is, I must protect my baby at all costs. And to see them strong-armed into taking injections when they're pregnant is quite frankly one of the most disgusting, outrageous things I've ever seen being done. And it all happened because the medical profession. In fact, everything that you saw, I mean, let's get real here. There isn't one thing you saw during the pandemic that happened without the blessing of the medical profession, because where else was the government getting their recommendations from? This is why doctors are totally to blame for that insanity.
I don't know if this is getting too personal, and frankly, so be it. But I've been a dad 5 times, and sadly, on the 3rd occasion, we lost our daughter stillborn at 31 weeks. Now, to go through that process and then to ask the questions, and we did find out through inquiry that it was a placental blockage problem with my wife, and they were able to use Clexane, etc., to have 2 further successful pregnancies, which was great. But my point is that during those pregnancies, I think I've become a little bit of an expert dad to understand that every doctor, every professional would say to my wife, "Oh no Sudafed, no Panadol, no alcohol, no cigarettes, no this, no that, no soft cheese." All of these things, it was no. And we're all brought up. Dr. William McBride, for goodness sake, an Australian doctor, discovered thalidomide and the birth defects caused by this morning sickness prevention pill. To then change that on a dime to tell you that experimental mRNA is suddenly safe and effective and pregnant women can take it, that alone is a line in the sand that I feel that every doctor who pushed that needs to be sent back to school and, dare I say, re-educated like they were trying to do to us, to say, hang on a second, you cannot possibly take this as a serious argument at this point when you have been telling these women for the last generation the exact opposite. It's not possible.
Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, same with babies and children. And these are low risk people. And we're talking about a virus which most people don't even have any symptoms for. I mean, what are you doing? Why the rush? I mean, it's so insane what we saw.
Yes.
I can list 100 examples too. While I was working in the hospital, I mean, I personally treated thousands of patients with COVID. At one stage, patients who had just recovered for COVID, literally they were there for this illness, were being told that in order to go to a rehab center or nursing home, they had to be vaccinated. And orders were being given to jab somebody who's literally just recovered from the illness. And think about the logical fallacy there. They've just recovered from the latest version of the virus, and you're giving them an injection for the old version when their antibodies are already high because they've just had an illness. But you're doing that because you want to tick a box. Highly dangerous. In fact, I've heard many cases, and I've actually had personal experiences from family and friends for older people who have been jabbed and literally died within a few days, and it's been listed as like old age, but it's highly suspicious. They got this huge antigenic stimulation and then passed away.
It saddens me every time I hear it, and it makes me incredibly angry. The one good thing about anger is, of course, it's the only sad emotion that provides you energy. I've since learnt and been taught, so therefore use it wisely. Thinking back again to that scenario, that there's so many stories, of course, of the Omicron here. So here in Australia, Omicron, we learn, comes about. So we now learn that it's far more easily transmissible, but far less dangerous. And at the same time, that was when the vaccine released here in Australia. So here we were going through, let's call the first strain Alpha, then it became Delta, was the most well-known strain until it switched to Omicron. And they then defined Omicron typically as more like cold and flu symptoms, even though Delta was not much worse than that. Although having caught it, it was the worst 60 hours of my life. It literally was 6 symptoms, 2 at a time, 20 hours apart, and they literally turned on and off. Wow. It was headache in the back of the head and nausea, 20 hours. And it was the back of the head. And I go, this is very unusual. I put an ice pack till Panadol lay down, and that would made it quite, I could cope with it. And then it turned into the runny nose and the sore throat, hours 21 to 40. And then the final one was vomiting and diarrhea for the final 20 hours, almost as if I was expelling it all. And it was, and I compared notes with other people here in Australia who reported similarly, and they said, you're exactly right. I never thought of it like that, but it was roughly 2 or 3 days, and there was 2 sets of symptoms at a time. And that's how we kind of knew. Now, I was never going down testing highway. I was reporting on it every day, and there was 20 million tests and 3 cases. It was ridiculous that I would go down that. We would see, service stations and hardware stores with cars out the front, 500 deep, waiting to stick a cotton bud up your nose, for goodness sake. Then we found out that, of course, most of the testing wasn't even being tested. They just delivered you a fake result, because they couldn't get through all the testing. That was another scandal that broke that people have forgotten about. It's ironic, Suneel, that we're here for an hour, and in 35 minutes we're still talking about this, and I didn't mean for this to happen.
Much to talk about. Yeah, we're immersed in this, but yeah, it's a great discussion, because the same things are bound to happen again unless we acknowledge the past and and bring more awareness of it. But yeah, it makes me angry too. It really does. But I've learned to temper that anger and channel it as you have.
And I'm not doing my best on today's discussion, but it is. Look, this is something that's 5 years in the making. So thanks again. Now let's just pause for a moment. There's two directions that I can take here. I do want to get to the nutrition, and there's a great clip from RFK that I may play in a little while. But I want to get on to this story that you wrote. That it said to me, I need to reach out again and see if we can create a time. I'm going to put up on the screen now for everyone. This is from your Substack. Should I lose hope in our fellow citizens? Time for honesty. This is August the 7th. So let me just run through what you talked about. Something happened to me the other day that I kept thinking about afterwards. I debated whether to share it, but I believe it reflects a deeper problem in our society that's getting worse, not better. Let me set the scene. I was in the public waiting area running an errand. Nothing remarkable, except for the fact I was alone with one other person, a man in his 30s, clearly very overweight, eating takeout. He had a huge soda in one hand, looked more like a bucket, and what appeared to be a large box of fries on his lap. We exchanged pleasantries, struck up a conversation. He was friendly, nice enough. Then he asked me what I did. I said, I'm a doctor. His demeanor shifted. He rolled his eyes and immediately began complaining. Man, I really hate the system. My insurance won't even cover my weight loss injection. He hadn't even prescribed one yet, just assumed he should be getting one and that someone else should pay for it. I listened politely, which I know you would have done. He went on a bit more about how unfair things were. Meanwhile, he kept eating bite after bite of fries, washing it down with soda that probably had 60 grams of sugar. I gently brought up the topic of natural health and lifestyle, but I could tell it wasn't what he wanted to hear, and it was the time or place for a deep conversation. Anyway, well, it wasn't. A few moments later, I was called away, and yet the exchange left a mark. That, to me, not only is it just a genuine, real doctor, a community leader, Suneel, this was something else, because you've decided, you've debated with yourself, and no, I'm telling this story. This sets the scene for everything that is wrong with society today. I'm entitled, I can eat whatever I want, I can do whatever I want, and it's always someone else's fault if it is. And my point is, I was working randomly in and out of the COVID lockdowns. A friend of mine rang me up. She was working for a local aged care charity organization, and she said, you're not going to believe this, my chef has quit, and you're the best cook I know. Can you come and help me out tomorrow as a volunteer? I said, what else am I doing? Of course I'll be there. I went there, had such a great time that I was offered a job. When the vaccine came out, all the oldies were rushing to get the jab. There was lots of debates, etc. And my supervisor said to me, and I said, look, I won't be taking this jab. I just won't be doing it. And she said, why don't you take it? And I gave her my reasons, mRNA, etc. And I presented her with articles, whatever. And she said, but you know that there's a compensation scheme. And she said, why don't you just take the jab? And if you get injured, sue them. I said, you couldn't give me $5 trillion to take this vaccine. I have young children. That is the last possible thing that I can do. But that is my point. Even at that level, she wanted to subcontract out her responsibility to a government and a check. I can't believe that was the case. But let's get back to this particular story, Suneel. What did you feel in that moment? What made you say, I'm going to write the story?
Well, I felt a mix of various emotions, and I was very honest in that Substack that I wrote. By the way, for anyone watching who doesn't follow my Substack, please do so. So I share a lot of stories like that. And when I first saw that and then processed it, at first I felt like he was like a friendly enough guy. Then I watched him, and I started to think, this is obviously somebody who's not doing the right thing. I mean, he should be in the prime of his life. He's in his 30s. He's obese. He's obviously with a BMI over 30. He mentioned something about having a family as well. And I did feel anger and also disgust, to be quite honest with you. Yeah. To see somebody who is clearly living his life in a suboptimal way. He's sadly going to have bad health if he hasn't already. But then the way that he just expected a weight loss injection, and the way he said it as if he's owed it. And to make clear, anyone who's watching, who's not in the United States, even though he may well have insurance, the general public still finds a way to pay for it, or his co-insurers will find a way to pay for it. But he didn't even think, and definitely didn't portray any sort of notion of it's my responsibility to get in shape for myself, for my family. I will eat whatever I want, do whatever I want, and then I'm owed this weight loss injection. And as you've said, and I'm glad it struck a chord with you, because this really gets to a deeper crisis that we have. And I think this has gone all across Western countries of a similar culture. Start in the US, gone to Canada, Ireland, UK, Australia, Canada, probably very different in many other countries where there's more collective responsibility. But we can talk about so much, Jason, whichever way you want to take this, whether it's the general decline of society, whether it's cultural rot, whether it's a spiritual crisis. There's so much we can talk about, but it summarizes how, unfortunately, tens of millions of our fellow citizens think. This is not an isolated incident. I repeat, it's not isolated.
No, it's not. And look, again, it becomes personal. And full disclosure, I was a little bit heavy. I was just over the threshold for type 2 diabetes. And I remember going back to the endocrinologist who wanted to put me on an 800 calorie a day diet. And I said, look, doc, I've got lots of kids. I've got a stressful job. I'm really struggling. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. And he said, look, you need to try it for 12 months. And if it doesn't work, because I mentioned bariatric surgery, and he said, come back in 12 months and we will review that and I'll write you a referral. To cut a long story short, that's exactly what had happened. Now, in my 20s, I had no problem losing 45 pounds and becoming quite fit and healthy, etc. But circumstances, life change, you put the weight on, and I knew that the yo-yoing was not going to be a good thing, because each time you yo-yo, you tend to be heavier than you were at the worst last time. So this was my psychology. I went along to the bariatric surgeon. He said, why are you here? And I said, well, I want to make sure I get rid of type 2 diabetes, not happy about sleep apnea machines and cholesterol. And he explained to me, and he said, well, look, you have the surgery. I only do gastric sleeves. I've done 1,000, never had a leak. So you're in good hands. And you'll lose 30 kilos, which is what, 65, 66 pounds. You'll lose it in 6 months and you'll add 20 years to your life expectancy. That's how he put it to me. I said, doc, where do I sign? That was how it worked. I took the 30 kilos off in 4 months. The problem that I had was, despite the dietitians and psychologists, no one explained to me that part of my reason was that I was self-medicating as a comfort eater with mental health, depression, etc. I didn't understand it until one day I worked it out for myself, because I was getting quite depressed. I looked better than I'd ever done. I was fitter than ever, but I only could eat what I could fit into the palm of my hand. And of course, my meal was over in 2 bites instead of enjoying something. Couldn't go to a restaurant, all of those things. I got up into the kitchen. I took out all the ingredients, lots of fresh food and etc. And I started chopping and doing what I did, and had a little bit of a taste, had a sip of a beer. And I extended that process for 2 hours one night, made a great meal for the family, and sat down, couldn't eat anything, but watched them. And then I realized that is how I have to deal with this. And I conquered this scenario. So from that moment on, for years, I was cooking as much as I could cook for everyone. I loved it. And that was how I enjoyed it. But it was mind over matter is where I'm going. Today, I say to people that what I did to solve my health issues, and they're still not perfect, there's certain side effects, etc. But I said I did the Lance Armstrong diet. That was surgery. It was a cheating, but it's not cheating because it was a practical method. But I like to joke about it. You have to self-deprecate in Australia, or you know one. You have to make fun of yourself. But that was my point there. That this is the thing. So this person's expecting an injection, not to go through the surgery, etc. Now I get that the surgery is radical. And from that moment on, if you eat too much, you're sick. You can't experience a lot of things. I think it can bring on other problems. I figured out. I think it might have triggered an autoimmune disease because not taking enough vitamin B12. So I'm learning as I'm going and conquering these things. But if you are not into it, academically, intellectually, physically, it is a challenge. And this is why I think people might be subcontracting out their responsibility to government. But we know that they only ever overpromise and underdeliver. And I think this is the point here, that this is the crucial moment in all of history, is self-determination, self-responsibility, etc., and then looking for the conditions to be able to do it. I'm just going to bring up a couple more points from the article for people. When you've already said it's not an isolated incident, blaming the system, expecting others to pay. Let's move. Who created the culture? This is the point. How did we get here? It's not just about individual decisions. It's about the broader system bears a lot of responsibility. The profit-driven medical culture that has trained people to expect solutions without effort. That's, I think, the point where we are today. How do we break clear of a system that is holding you down and holding you back for its benefit, pretending that it's serving you? You have to believe that a doctor is serving you. But we learnt now from the last 5 years that they weren't. They were serving something or someone else.
Yep, it's true. And this is not going to be easy. I have a feeling that eventually everything will swing back, because the current road we're on, I mean, let's look at statistics. I'm sure Australia is not far behind, but in the US, we have an over 50% obesity rate. Type 2 diabetes is soaring. We got 50% almost of adolescents now with pre-diabetes. I mean, this is unprecedented. This has never happened before. I'd like everybody watching to understand, in the whole of human history, nothing like this has happened, where so many young people especially are now getting sick. And if we think the situation is bad now, wait 10 or 20 years, type 2 diabetes is going to hit. People are going to become more sick. So they'll all get type 2 diabetes in their 20s and 30s. And these, I mean, even if we look statistically, the weight loss injections, most people stop it after 12 months because the side effects are intolerable. And it's just not a long-term solution. So there's two ways I think this will end. Either things are going to get so bad that entire nations are going to collapse under the weight, no pun intended, of all of these medical problems. And then other countries which are not so unhealthy are basically going to surge ahead and take over. That's one way. Or, as often happens if you read history, things are just going to get to a point where they implode and then start up again. But it's not going to look good for the next 20 years or so. I mean, I look around all the time. If you look at what's happening with children, that's the most worrying thing. Then you worry about them growing up, having issues with fertility. It's just awful. It's unprecedented. So nobody can actually predict what way this is going to go. How do we get away from this culture? So one of the evolutionary moments of my sort of online journey, which you may be familiar with, is go back 6 months or a year. I used to, like a lot of online influencers, be pointing at the system more, like processed food corporations, which are terrible, and blaming social media, blaming all sorts of things. But I've really come to the realization, I'm keen to get your thoughts on this as well, Jason. I really think that this is a cultural and spiritual crisis, because the most important thing in anybody wanting to be in shape and look good is their desire to do so. And when you have young people now sort of slipping away, not caring about this in their prime of life, and then all their friends are the same way, this is almost like a social contagion. And people are addicted to screens, they're sedentary. But I don't think that the food environment has changed that much in the last 20 years. But obesity has absolutely soared, especially over the last several years of the pandemic. And what sort of is a clincher for me in thinking about this is that countries with a similar culture have all gone the same way. Whereas you go to Greece, Italy, Japan, South Korea, this has not happened. So it's a cultural phenomenon in our countries.
I really like the comparison there, and it's interesting when you mention parts of Mediterranean countries that may have largely resisted. So you can't necessarily point the finger at the internet age, and the idea that our kids' lives have been filled with so much screen time, so much so that there was a phenomenon that I noticed maybe a decade ago, where you would literally have a group of kids sitting together, all on their phones, communicating with anyone but for whom they were sitting amongst. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the illustration of the problem that we have. And then you now have a situation that, for example, I've teamed up with a young lady that I met in her 30s, and we're doing a new show together to kind of get a cross between a Gen X 50-something and a 30-something, just to see. And one of the subjects that we want to talk about is dating in the modern age, and the idea that so many more people are struggling to find partners, for example. The other interesting statistic that I saw on Sky News this week was that of the baby boomers, 91% identify as heterosexual. In the Gen Zs, they're saying 66% are identifying as heterosexual. That is an alarming statistic in a generation. Now, is that because of a problem of perhaps attention, perhaps an incapability of perhaps associating with the other sex, which doesn't make sense. In this modern age, it's much easier to communicate with a lot more people than you ever did before. Is it an indoctrination? Is it, dare I say, something that's in medical interventions, that's twisting DNA and chromosomes, etc.? That's an area you're not allowed to talk about. There are so many things that just don't add up anymore. And when you get back to this other part of society, so mum and dad go to work. In my generation, mum being a nurse, she could have periods of her life where she'd stay at home and raise the kids when we were in primary school and young, and by choice she went out to work. But then when the financial system in Australia mid-80s was changed and they deregulated that system, that was a notable point. For example, a fixed interest rate on a home loan in the mid-80s was 13.5%, and property prices went up very slowly. When Paul Keating changed that and brought in the deregulated the financial sector, interest rates went overnight from 13.5% to 7%. And what did that do? Doubled the price of housing overnight, which forced mum and dad to both go to work. So there was a very different culture. And therefore, if that's the case, the fast food culture certainly sped up, and therefore you were born into it, as opposed to the fact that you had mum at home for that upbringing period. And I don't know if that's a real clincher. But of course, not every mum or dad, not every home has two parents, certainly two parents in them, let alone two parents working. So it is a confusing scenario, and I don't quite know where that thing has come from. But then that's when I look back at internet age, but it's also the lack of skills. Like, my kids guilty of playing the games and forever telling my son to get off and put time limits. And sometimes my wife and I joke that the reason we gave him a PlayStation was so that we could take it off him. It's horrible that would be the case, but this is the point again. But how do you build up the skills? For example, I coach the cricket team. We are struggling to get kids to play cricket. They've shortened the game from 4 hours to 2 hours. We've got girls playing with boys. Well, exactly. And they're coming to Australia.
Fewer Australians playing cricket.
This is a good point. Yeah. And I tell you what, you are certainly in the box seat to win the Ashes this summer here in Australia, and this is the point, we are struggling to find cricketers to play, and I don't understand it. And across the board. What is with that? But I'll tell you one thing, the complaints I get from parents is it's so expensive now to enroll your kids in soccer, $250 for a season to play. For example, this season, second season in a row, 75% of games were washed out due to bad weather. Parents are saying, well, it's not worth playing $250 for 4 games. I'm not doing it. So again, blaming someone else. Why have the conditions changed so much? I don't have a single answer. I think it's a culmination of factors, but there's also this willingness, and the time poor environment that we live in must add to it.
Yeah, I do think that, like with many things, there's probably a combination of things. I happen to believe now that culture is the main thing. I'll give you an example. I went to France last year, Paris, and hardly saw anyone overweight French. Clearly over there, they're still very much into you should look skinny. And go back to our culture 20, 30 years ago and watch shows on TV. There was clearly a more demand. Demand might not be the right word to use, but there was clearly a trend towards people thinking that being in shape is a great thing. And somebody who was the one odd person out would have been quickly brought back by the culture around them, saying, why are you putting on weight? Come back to everybody else. I really don't think that we should lose that aspect of it. As soon as a group of people start going a certain way, it's like a domino effect. And I think that's what's happened, especially with young people. I mean, in the US, I actually believe between 20 and 30, we probably have a 50% obesity rate. I'm not even talking about being overweight, I'm talking about being obese. This has drastically changed in the last 20 years. And again, I think that cultural aspects come into it much more, because somebody who's young and wants to be in shape will find a way to be in shape. And
And of course, the other thing was the attracting of a partner, to be in your best position, to be able to attract the partner that you most desire, the whole chemistry aspect of it. It's interesting you brought up France, because years ago I worked as a home shopping TV producer, and I remember we used to talk about the French paradox when talking about resveratrol as a particular product. And of course, the French, have high rates of smoking and drinking red wine.
And drink as well, yeah.
This is the crazy thing. So that is such an interesting point to park there. I think this is a good juncture as we get towards the close, and the hour has just evaporated before our very eyes. But Bobby Kennedy, RFK Jr., has come out today, and he's talked specifically about a new approach to lifestyle or diseases of diet, and explained that most doctors aren't even taught nutrition in school. We had a GP that told us the same thing. We in a 6-year degree, we spent an afternoon on nutrition. Therefore, is this the missing link?
I'm very happy with this news. I think I would have been happier had I heard this news 6 months ago, because my views on this have somewhat changed. I have two thoughts. First, yes, absolutely, you want doctors to hammer home this point, and I think the very first thing in their note as they write an assessment and plan should be, what is this patient's metabolic health? Because people do listen to what doctors say. I mean, like I just said, the whole pandemic response was based on what the medical profession said. And you hammer home the point enough, like with smoking, a certain percentage of people will listen and say, doctors saying don't do that. So yeah, I'm all for doctors learning nutrition. But the second part of this is I wonder what the nutrition teaching will be, because there's many different viewpoints on what is good nutrition. Hopefully the bare basics will be there, like you want to limit your sugars, carbs, optimize protein, go for the colorful foods, limit portions. If it's common sense like that, then great. If they start getting weird about it and thinking that certain dietary ingredients, which the Make America Healthy Again movement doesn't like, are the main problem, instead of focusing on the bigger problem, then I'm not such a fan of it. So let's see how that pans out and what the nutrition teaching actually is.
Well, it's absolutely crucial, isn't it, that a new step, a new direction has to be taken. And the one thing that that Bobby Kennedy has done is he's taken this, the bull by the horns. If anything, he could have been a very useful attorney general just the same. And he chose that he wanted to get into the health area, despite the fact that he'd been quite brilliant over the years of taking on these big pharma companies. But of course, the other thing was that recently he took away the funding of some 22 mRNA vaccines in development. So that's got to be a big thing as well.
Yeah.
He's got Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Marty Makary on side, it seems, across these different agencies. So at the very least, we can feel confident that the one thing that the United States has been able to do in this entire information war, certainly spiritual, and today's events, sadly in Minnesota with this shooter that took out these poor children in this Catholic church, in this school in the early week, was another example of the madness that's going on there. And that's just a very quick aside. But we've since been given or seen access to the a so-called manifesto, a horrific video showing an intent to kill and hate and maim, etc. And you just wonder, what type of sickness are we dealing with here? A mental health crisis. But the thing that I noted, that on some of these magazines with the rounds, the bullets in them, there were references to Satan, pentagrams, hate, kill, these horrific things. And it also came down to, this is an area I wasn't expecting to touch on, but there is a pattern now amongst these shooters, that there's this weird transgender thing going on there that they're identifying in these different ways. And we've now had a political divide. The left wing is promoting it like you wouldn't believe. Parents in Australia are being punished if they dare question it, and the state wants to take over if a child comes forward. It feels like it's more of a recruiting exercise as much as anything else to legitimize. And I don't know where that comes from, but if the parent is no longer allowed to parent the child and loses parental rights. I used to be very open. I'd say, look, ScoMo or whoever, Anthony Albanese in Australia, put your name on my birth certificate if you're going to be my parent, and you can be responsible for me from this point. And you can also leave me an inheritance when you go, because it is unacceptable. There has to be a price that these people in authority have to pay. There is no accountability. Bureaucrats are brilliant at hiding behind someone else and always blaming someone else. And that is probably the reason why this culture has permeated. No one is responsible for their own actions anymore in the 21st century. And ironically, when you are, Suneel, you thrive. Just to acknowledge your career for a moment, off your bio, a doctor, a personal trainer, a writer, a public speaker. I mean, how many hours have you got in the day, and why don't we have that many hours? What are you doing that we aren't?
Well, I enjoy what I do. I've done these things over many years. I've always had a creative streak. So I like doing things outside of the box. I'm not your bog standard doctor, as you might imagine. Coming back for a moment on something that you said there, I know we're coming to the end of the hour, but I've seen the same things about the shooting patterns in the United States, and this hits home because some of these shootings have happened close to where I live. And don't also rule out the role of medications, because psychiatric medications are dished out like candy to youngsters in the United States. It's awful. And many of these are mind altering as well.
That is such an interesting point, because one of the commentators mentioned today in just an off-the-cuff remark said a generation fed SSRIs. That is literally what he said, and that's the point. And we're talking about depression, anxiety types of medication. And isn't it ironic that as a side effect, they sometimes say suicidal ideation? Now, I have looked at that and considered, as someone who has been offered that in the past and briefly been on these medications, if your mind, your mood doesn't change, do you become more depressed because the medication to treat said depression and anxiety, let's say, hasn't kicked in or hasn't worked, and that's the reason why the ideation may form? I feel like there's a missing link in this understanding.
Yeah, that has actually been documented. In some people who take medication, symptoms can actually get worse. These are bona fide mind-altering drugs, and you're giving them to young people too, whose brains are still developing. It's awful. There's those, and also even Adderall, which is being crazily prescribed in the United States. So they're getting youngsters hooked on drugs earlier and earlier. It's a tragic situation. This goes back to what I was saying. This is truly unprecedented. What is happening right now never happened before, where we have a generation of young people who are not only so metabolically sick, but they're also medicated to the hilt. Sadly, I believe it's going to get a lot worse over the next 10 to 20 years. I'm not sure we can reverse this very quickly.
Yeah, and with a fertility crisis, it may work in reverse, but the irony is that those that want to create families are the ones that we hear are struggling. That doesn't make sense either. But as we get to the end, and maybe we'll make this the last question, as a community leader yourself, as somebody who is living his best life, who is leading by example, what advice may you give to somebody getting to the end of school, maybe in their 20s, maybe a little bit sort of unsure, not got the direction? What would you suggest would be the best way to find their smile and their North Star as they choose to say, no more is anyone else responsible for my failures? It will be me creating my successes.
That is a great question. And as you just finished up with, I would say the very first thing that you should have your mindset set upon basically for success in life is complete ownership of absolutely everything you do. Do not put anything on anybody else's shoulders, whether it's the government or any other authority. Nobody is going to come and save you. The truth is that actually we are living in the best of times. If we look at the level of comforts now that our ancestors could only dream of, what's available to us, we have heat, we have fresh water, we can travel all over the world. But yet we have a generation, and if anybody young is listening to this, you might feel this around you. There's just total anxiety, stress, depression. And yes, there'll always be that when you're young. I would say the very first thing is to focus on your health. That is true at any age. So don't fall into those bad habits. Your health comes number one. Eat clean, be sensible, limit all the junk and the sugars, work out every single day, no excuses if you're young. And you will find if you get that foundation of your physical health in place, a lot of other things will flow from that, including improved mental clarity, focus, ability to really think what path you want to be on. Think outside the box, keep an open mind, don't go for the cookie cutter life. There are many things that you could be doing that you probably haven't thought of. So keep an open mind, befriend as many people as you can, even online, get some really good mentors, know roughly the path you want to go on, but understand that that path can deviate at any stage. Never stop learning. Don't think that you know it all. But I would say The number one piece of advice to enable you to have success is to make your health the number one priority. Everything else will flow from there.
It's a beautiful, beautiful response. And I'm reminded, I think I said it yesterday as well, but RFK Jr. said, a healthy person has 1,000 dreams and a sick person has one.
Absolutely. Well said.
And there it is. Dr. Suneel Dhand, before you go, can you please let everyone know the best places that they can find you?
Yes, so you could come straight to my website, www.drsuneeldhand.com. We'll have the spelling for you in a link down below. I have a lot of social media channels. My biggest ones are YouTube and Twitter. I also have Instagram and a Facebook page, but YouTube and Twitter are the main ways to follow me. And I hope that if you do so, I can impart some good advice on you on living your best possible life as naturally as possible.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for, you know what, sometimes when they say when you meet the people that you look up to or your heroes, you're disappointed. On the contrary, this has been every little bit as good and much better than I ever could have hoped. It has been a divine privilege to be able to connect with you one-on-one. And I'm going to dedicate this to a mutual friend, the late Dr. Jackie Stone, who would spend many hours with me on the phone, providing encouragement and advice, etc. She introduced me to one of your colleagues, Dr. Tim Kelly, through a TNT connection, and she, her memory lives on forever as somebody who has inspired and all of us to do the best that we could, and we miss her immensely. Thank you, Dr. Dhand.
Thank you very much.
And on that note, we will conclude today's show. I hope to see you all on the next show, and I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. See you all next time. Thank you.